episode 2 of Southern Fried Asian. Once again, I'm your host, Keith Chow. First off, thank you for everyone who tuned in last week to our very first episode with Brad Jenkins. Thanks for all the overwhelming responses I've received on the various feeds on the internet. I'm super excited for today's episode. We're talking with Thao Nguyen, the lead singer and frontwoman of an amazing band called Thao and Get Down, Stay Down. There's a film coming out about Thao's recent visit to her mother's homeland of Vietnam. So we're going to talk to Thao about that. Their most recent album, 2016's A Man Alive, has been praised on outlets such as Rolling Stone, NPR. Thao actually grew up in Virginia. She went to school at William & Mary, which is located in Williamsburg. So we talk about our home state and talk about a lot of things. So please check out my conversation with Thao Nguyen of Thao and Get Down, Stay Down. And check out her new movie called Nobody Dies, debuting on PBS this fall.
Not to say I wasn't grieving in the evening. Not to say I want another just like the other. I send all of it. I take all of it.
Really excited about the guest I have on the line with me right now. She is a musician and songwriter and frontwoman for the band Thao and Get Down, Stay Down. She is also a native Virginian like myself. Please welcome to Southern Fried Asian, Thao Nguyen.
Hello, good afternoon.
Or whenever it is that you're listening to this podcast.
Or good morning, or good night.
Thank you so much for being one of our first guests on the show. I'm honored to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to say up front, I'm a huge fan. And I actually wasn't aware that you were from Virginia until very recently. So that's why you're here on the show. And one of the things I wanted to just kind of get at off the bat is just, I think you grew up in Northern Virginia, but you also went to college in Williamsburg. So like you kind of spanned the entire state. So talk a little bit about what was it like growing up? And I think you grew up in Falls Church, which isn't, there's actually a lot of Asian Americans in Falls Church. So it's not like you were like isolated, but what was that like growing up in Northern Virginia?
It was, I think because of the proximity to DC, I didn't so much consider it the South as far as what my sort of understandings of the South were.
I think a lot of people feel that way about Northern Virginia.
yeah, Northern Virginia, and also I don't think anyone in the South considers Northern Virginia to be part of the South.
That's true.
How was it? It was, it was an incredibly suburban experience. When I look back on my childhood, I felt pretty confined, and I didn't necessarily. I think it was a pretty isolated upbringing, and I did hang out with. There were neighbors and friends from school, but I didn't really spend a lot of time with them outside of school.
Right.
And as far as the Vietnamese sort of diaspora and the I would presume entirely South Vietnamese population, community within Northern Virginia definitely was present, and my parents' friends were around, and I grew up playing with their kids. But I didn't feel it. How to explain? It wasn't necessarily that I identified as Vietnamese or Vietnamese American, and there was still a really, for me and for my older brother, I think a pretty sizable push toward assimilation, and we obviously were very aware that we came from a refugee immigrant family, but we tried our best to to not acknowledge it. And that's just, when that is nothing but when you're a kid, you just want to be as comfortable as possible and fit in as much as you can. And it already, based on the way you look and the family you come from, you're already not going to feel that comfortable.
Right, especially like if you think about adolescence, right? You go through all of these kind of like hormonal changes and emotional changes, and then like when you throw race into that, like, alchemy, it probably isn't always the best outcome in terms of like self-esteem and things like that. But I did want to talk about, it's funny that you said Northern Virginia. Like, people in the South look at like, Northern Virginia and think that's not really the South. If you look at it like an electoral map of Virginia, that's usually the bluest the bluest part of the map. But I actually grew up not too far from Northern Virginia too, because I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, which is about like an hour and a half from Falls Church, Arlington, Alexandria, but it's very rural. Like you grew up in the suburbs, I grew up in like rural Virginia, but at the same time, you could get in a car and drive an hour and a half and go to DC. Eden Center is like a stone's throw, right? Like there were actually community. But one of the things that I find really interesting about your music is that there's definitely some twinge of like country and folk and music that's not necessarily associated with Asian Americans. When you think of like, there's a lot of indie and there's a lot of like, there's some punk influences too. And you do see more Asian Americans in like indie bands and things, I guess. But like country and folk, would you say that was an influence musically on you? And did that have anything with growing up in Virginia?
Yeah, definitely. And I credit growing up in Virginia and going to school in Virginia, and I'm very grateful for that musical influence. And when I first started picking up guitar, and my interest in playing guitar and playing banjo and mandolin and all that comes from the influence of Appalachian music and old time and country blues that I would hear throughout my childhood, but then especially when I went to school in southeastern Virginia.
Right. And
that is one of the primary. If there are multiple backbones, then that is definitely one of them. And I credit the efforts that I took to when I was teaching myself. I was aspiring to the kind of finger picking that I heard in that music.
What made you decide you wanted to be like? How old were you when you first picked up a guitar, and what made you decide to pick up that guitar?
I was 12. Oh, one thing I'll say, in addition to that, the country influences that my dad was a big fan of Marty Robbins and country music. Both my parents would listen to, they'd listen to the more traditional folk Vietnamese music and then more of the modern stuff, the rock and roll and stuff coming out of Vietnam. But then they would also listen to Marty Robbins and Elvis Presley and Randy Travis. So it was a funny combination. But guitar-wise, I picked up guitar when I was about 11 or 12. And I think the primary driver was boredom and loneliness.
which animates most musicians, I think. That's kind of
right, yeah.
Picks up an instrument.
It comes from a dark and light place. Yeah.
And were there was there a particular guitar player you were aspiring to be like? Was there a particular musician where you were influenced to, beside I guess the Randy Travises and that your parents were listening to? What were the musicians that you were listening to at 12 that made you decide you wanted to follow in those footsteps?
At 12, it was I had. A few years prior to that, gotten really interested in Motown and 60s rock music, 60s folk music. And then my brother was a big hip-hop fan, So I was listening to that. And then once I realized I wanted to write songs and be able to play them, and I wanted to learn guitar as to serve the songs I wanted to write. That was, let's see, more of that 60s folk, I guess. And around that time, I was 12, I started to see women playing music, which to that point I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to. And that, of course, was around the time that Lillith Fair was happening. And I didn't, and, who else was, there was a whole movement around women-powered bills. And they, lineups that were
not
all
to date
entirely
you, but
women.
this is like mid-90s, right? So we're talking like...
This is mid-90s,
Liz
yeah.
Fair,
And this is...
kinda,
Right.
Sarah MacLachlan. I mean, you mentioned Lillith Fair, so
Yeah.
those are the acts that
Totally.
come to mind.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'll say it. I was a huge Sarah MacLachlan fan.
There's no shame.
And
There's no shame on Southern Friday.
And I loved the idea of imagining that I could be a woman leading a band, or being, writing the songs and being the soul, the engine for the music that I wanted to make.
You started your first band while you were still in high school, right? That was a few years after you picked up the guitar, and then you started actually playing music, writing songs, and you started up kind of like an early iteration of the band you're in now, right? And,
I don't know if I would... I think it was definitely... I don't know if it was an early iteration. It was the first journey, the beginning of the endeavor.
Right.
It was sort of like a folk pop duo. And the first, the reason we formed was to be in the high school talent show.
Oh, nice.
And there was an open mic night scene that I really cut my teeth on all of the local open mic nights.
Was this throughout like D.C. and Virginia?
Yeah, this was throughout Northern Virginia and D.C. And my friend Brenna and I would write the songs, and then we would. That was also when the Dixie Chicks were really big, and that definitely veered more towards folk and country. And it was just me and guitar and the both of us singing, and so that was the beginning. But that and then when I got to college, or I guess as time went on, the songs and the content, I was more interested in veering away from folk and more of the country influence, and wanted to have a rock band.
Right. Why do you think that you don't see? Because I'm assuming, and you should never assume, but I'm assuming when you were going to these open mic nights and kind of like getting thrust into that scene, there weren't probably a lot of other Asian Americans in there, or was that, am I completely wrong? And were there like a ton of Asian Americans? And
oh no, you're very right. There were exactly zero. It was I am very grateful for those experiences, because they made me I not only cut my teeth on them, but I had to sort of bare my teeth, and it made me a much better guitar player. I found that as soon as I walked in, I was dismissed on a lot of levels.
Right.
And if you walk in with an acoustic guitar, there are not a lot of different ideas circulating. There's pretty much one idea, and so I knew that through my playing, I wanted to debunk what they thought it was going to be, and I knew I had to command respect through my playing, and that's why I spent a lot of time being my own sort of rhythm and lead, and really wanted to spend a lot of time focused on my finger picking and more percussive elements of playing. People were very supportive as well, but it was primarily, It was a lot of white dudes.
And you had to prove yourself.
Yeah, you had to prove yourself, and you had to show that you were serious about playing and about songwriting and about performing, and I considered it a challenge to get people to listen. You know, as soon as I began the songs, I wanted our act to be commanding attention.
Well, and that foundation led you to where you are now. But before we get to now, you mentioned you went to, I think, did you go to William and Mary?
I did, yes.
Which is in Williamsburg. And for people who are not familiar with the geography of Virginia, Williamsburg is, as you mentioned, in the southeastern part of the state. But it's also kind of, I mean, I wouldn't call Williamsburg like rural, but it is a little like set off in its own little town, right? Like it's not necessarily even Falls Church is just a stone's throw from DC. Williamsburg is a little bit more remote, a little bit more distant from like, I guess the closest big city is Hampton or Norfolk.
Right.
Which is where I went to. I went to ODU, so we're both.
Oh, cool.
So how would you describe the scene in Williamsburg compared to where you were in Falls Church in Northern Virginia?
The first thing I think of when I recall Williamsburg, Virginia, is Colonial Williamsburg, which is, I like to call it the 24-hour reenactment. And I know that it's not exactly 24 hours, but it's
basically.
It's basically, I mean, that's a fully functioning town set in the colonial period. And that was essentially our downtown area. That was sort of the hub. And there were all these very old county and city ordinances that didn't allow bars, so you had a couple taverns instead. And it was really it was not so conducive to college life, because there would be ordinances that wouldn't permit people who were not related, more than 3 people, to live in a house together.
Oh, is that right?
Because it was like an old brothel rule or
oh man,
something.
I had no idea.
But I think so there was that, and then there was just the kind of bubble of a pretty pristine seeming college campus. It was a liberal arts school, but still a Virginia State school, and I learned a lot there. I value my time there. I'm very grateful for it. I'm grateful for the education that I got. But I spent a lot of my time playing music on my own, and but I will say that my interest in social activism, aligning with different social justice causes, and my women's empowerment, women's advocacy work, all were very much bolstered and encouraged through the school, through my courses in sociology and women's studies. So
that kind of really formed a lot of your identity when you went. I mean, I guess that's the case for a lot of people. You go to college, you kind of find out about yourself. I talk with people, again, when you grow up in the South, typically in a community that's not necessarily like an Asian American enclave, unlike growing up in the Bay Area, for example.
Right.
I used to tell people, like, I wasn't Asian American until I got to college. Like, that wasn't a term that I even thought about, because it's like when you're the only Chinese people in a town, there's no Asian American, right? You're like, you're
totally.
and
yeah.
And like, was that a similar case for you? I know that, like you said, in the school you went to, there was probably more Asians, and there was a larger Vietnamese community you were a part of in Northern Virginia. But did you feel that going to college and kind of meeting others, helped you kind of formulate a more active social identity? It did.
I think it. There's a couple of things. Well, backing up, when I went to school, or going to school in Northern Virginia, there were a lot of. I didn't know a lot of other Asian kids, and I didn't hang out with any. but thankfully it wasn't so monochromatic. But the populations were more Latino kids and Middle Eastern kids. But so I didn't know I definitely didn't hang out with any other kids that were Vietnamese. And so I would see them, but I didn't really socially interact with them.
Right.
And then once I got to college, what I am so grateful for about college was that it made me proud of the family that I came from and proud of my ethnicity and heritage. And it made me interested and curious in a way that I had not been. And that's, that's a reckoning of my own that I make and a concession that I acknowledge. Is I think there was a lot of internalized shame or embarrassment or even internalized racism that I embodied or sort of quietly harbored, or and what that did was I didn't allow myself to be proud of the people I come from, and so once I got to college, and then there was that the Asian American identity, and there's and I, even though I wasn't necessarily involved in those kind of any kind of Asian American cultural group, any of like sponsored activities or whatever.
Right.
I mean, obviously I knew they existed, but I still couldn't go there. But what did happen was that I started to take more of an interest in Vietnam and trying to go, and I signed up for this volunteer trip to go to Vietnam to help with I don't know what it was going to be helpful somehow. I can't remember how. And but then SARS happened, and so that trip was canceled. So yes,
well, that's actually a good segue into the documentary that that is premiering soon. I think on PBS, and funded through CAM Media, which is the Center for Asian American Media. I was lucky enough to see an early screening of it, so it's fantastic. And one of the things that really kind of affected me was just seeing. I guess for those people who aren't aware, the film is called Nobody Dies. It's named after one of the tracks off your latest album, Man Alive, and it follows you and your mother going back to Vietnam. I think her first time since fleeing the country, and your first time ever. When did this trip happen? When was the movie filmed?
The movie was filmed July of 2015, and that entire trip happened because the band was invited to Vietnam to play, to sort of help commemorate the 20th anniversary of the normalization of relations between U.S. and Vietnam. So it was a bit of a diplomatic event.
How did the Get Down, Stay Down get involved with that?
I don't know. There were promoters in Vietnam who had wanted us to come over, and I've wanted to. I just there are so many factors and scheduling, touring, and time, and all the things. So it had never come to fruition. And then some promoters got in touch and asked if we would consider, and somehow then I think they developed a relationship with the U.S. Embassy, and the embassy was who could make it financially possible. Yeah, and then they made it happen.
And then your band got invited to be part of this diplomatic event. When did the idea to take your mom and then not only that, but like have a film crew follow you around?
Yeah,
because that's I guess that's an easy way to think about, like, not having to bring a camcorder with you and stuff. But
right, yeah. I don't like to be on a device, so I just invite a crew. I had known that if I were ever to go back to Vietnam or go there for the first time, I wanted the first time to be with my mom. And I knew that my first trip would be her first trip back. And, there are many reasons why it took so long to get there. But one of them, I didn't want to go without her, and so it was an issue of timing and scheduling and her waning and waxing interest, and a very complicated interest in going back, and so then when the opportunity arose, it was sort of an ideal way. It was sort of the dream scenario is that I would be going back for work as a musician, and then that my job would allow me to bring my mom back, and it just sort of, in a way it all felt inevitable, but in another way we could have easily gone our lives without making this trip together.
How important was it to you to not only, because I know that this is, several years after your first attempt to try to go to Vietnam, but how important was it for you to go there as, not just a visitor, but as like, I'm loath to use the word, I'm sure you probably will roll your eyes on a podcast, but like as a celebrity, as a someone who's, invited by the government of all people, right? Like, it's not just, you're just hopping on a plane, right? Like what was that feeling like, that you're kind of, prodigal daughter almost kind of feeling?
It was, it wasn't a requirement, but I'm really glad it happened that way. And I am very grateful that, my job allowed us the opportunity to do this. I don't know I wasn't sure that anyone involved thought about it as, it definitely wasn't a celebrity thing. It was more like a kid, a daughter of refugees,
sure,
is coming, and that's, it's cool that,
but
it's cool. Yeah.
Let's be real here, though. I mean, like, you guys, you're part of a very critically acclaimed band, and your music has been featured in Rolling Stone, NPR. It's not like you're a little nobody going to Vietnam. Let's just let's lay our cards on the table.
Thanks. But we're all raised to be so modest and humble. It's hard to acknowledge anything. It was deeply gratifying, and I was very proud of the fact that this was how it was going down, that this was how it was happening. And I think that my mom was very proud of me, and my family loved it. And I do think there was a sense of triumph and celebration for her in sort of bringing her daughter home.
And the other side of that was bringing the movie, and the director.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Todd Krulzik,
right.
Who did he approach you, or like how did the idea of making a movie out of this trip?
That's right. I forgot about that. Todd's a really good friend of mine, and years ago he made one of our first music videos, and I've just known him for probably a decade now, over a decade, and we had been talking about working on a music video together or some sort of collaboration, and then this trip came up, and it actually, the odds of something like this coming together are very slim, and so for months it was a limbo of whether or not we'd actually be able to do it and be able to take the band and all that. And then once it was confirmed, it was sort of automatic that that he would try to make this trip with us, because we knew whatever it was momentous, if nothing else, for my family. And the story of my mom, not returning for 42 years, and to do that with her and to be able to capture it, that part was, I think we both wanted it documented for whatever purpose it would find. And I didn't think this would be happening. I didn't think there'd be a short film and then PBS would pick it up. But so when all this footage was being collected and captured, I was so glad that we had it, just for the family to have, and for at that point, my grandmother was still alive, and a lot of what my mom was excited about was that we could get all this footage, and she could, then she'd be able to see what Vietnam was like now, and she'd be able to see us there. But I didn't know what was going to happen with it. I thought maybe it might be set to music. It might be used as sort of more tour archival stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, it's definitely like in the pantheon of like the music documentary, right? Like where where you have a filmmaker follow a band around while they're touring. You think of like The Who or Rolling Stones, kind of, like those classic rock docs. But what I was saying earlier, like I feel like this was kind of a rock documentary, but like on another level because it was so emotional. It was such an emotional experience that I can imagine just for you and your mother, and you touch on a lot of things about what we've been talking about, kind of like growing up in the household that you grew up in, and I wonder, there are a lot of issues with your father that you talk about in the movie, and even on your most recent album. Do you think that had anything to do with what you were saying earlier about that kind of internalized feelings about your ethnicity? Do you think there was like a correlation between that and your complicated feelings about your father?
I haven't considered it in that way.
Because it's never conscious, right? When we
it's not conscious. I think that there was so much conflict and so much strife and turmoil that I wanted to separate in any way that I could, and so I guess sort of separating from my cultural identity was part of that. Yeah, so I know it is so emotional, and I got to be honest with you, which is so funny that this is being aired, because when I was doing those interviews, especially the more emotional ones, I couldn't help those kind of surges of emotion, and if I could have, I would have. And the sort of safety latch that I was thinking about as this was happening was, well, this footage won't make it anywhere.
Except everywhere.
Except fuck. Yeah. And then Todd would send a cut, and I was like, oh my God, like can we cut that part? But unfortunately that part is a very compelling component of and it's the truth, and it's very honest, and all I'm thinking about is my family does not, this is generally speaking,
Asians,
this is a generalization,
Asians don't show
but
emotions, right?
They do not like this, and then they also don't like family business being talked about.
Airing your dirty laundry.
Right, and I'm, obviously a lot of families don't like that, but mine really, I'm pretty sure they really don't. And so
your mom wouldn't even share her favorite poem. I mean, come on.
Right, I know, exactly. And then it's a really interesting display of, what happens when cultures collide in one person, so then you have me talking about it and crying and stuff, and then the next moment I'm trying to get the footage cut. My only hope is that, and everyone in the family just doesn't talk about it. We all act like it didn't happen, which is totally reasonable.
Yeah,
right?
That's a very Asian thing to do, I think, actually, to be honest.
Yeah, that's so I'm nervous, but at the same time, knowing us, I'm thinking no one's going to say anything, and I'm just gonna write it out. Like I don't know what you guys are talking about.
So, there's actually a screening of the film coming up on September 7th in San Francisco. You'll be doing, I think, a Q&A and performing at this event. Will this be your first time viewing it in like public? With other people sitting next to you?
I know.
Are you prepared for
I
this?
don't know if I can. I don't think I'm gonna watch. I think I'm gonna tune my guitar or something over and over again. And they're flying my mom out, and which I think will be really sweet. But she's not.
Has your mom seen the movie?
No, she hasn't. And true to form, we haven't really. I haven't really talked about it. She knows. I mean, to me, this film is a tribute to her. It is it's like a love letter to her and the life that she's led and all she's sacrificed for us. And that's probably the main reason I'm okay with it being in the world, is that it's really important to honor her and honor my family in that way. But the details of it, she doesn't know. We haven't talked about it. And I thought that the easiest way to deal with it was just to have it happen there. And then maybe she could just black out in moments and then bounce back. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely going to be, I think it's going to be a really fun event. Fun in relative terms, I guess, depending on your perspective when you're actually in the theater room. But it's going to be at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco on September 7th. I think tickets are still available, but they're selling quickly. So if you're listening to this, please log on to jccsf.org and find tickets to the Nobody Dies. I don't know if this is the premiere or just an event funded, sponsored by CAM and
the JCC,
the Jewish Community Center.
Is it? Yeah. It is the world premiere, as they say.
There you go. And then it'll be on PBS stations. Check your local listings in the fall, I think. Mm-hmm. But we usually end Southern Fried Asian talking about food, just because one of the things about Southern culture one of the prominent things of Southern culture is the food. And similarly, for Asian cultures, we put a premium on food. In fact, I don't know if it's the same in Vietnamese, but I know in Chinese, we don't say hello, we say, have you eaten? And so is just thinking back again to your kind of like experience growing up in Virginia and parts south, was there a particular dish that you remember, whether it was a Vietnamese dish or not, or something that you ate while you were in Williamsburg? I don't know. I don't know what Williamsburg is famous for food-wise, other than like colonial times. But is there a particular like dish that reminds you of home, like a comfort food?
Yeah, definitely. It was it would be either rockfish or it was typically like a giant rockfish that's steamed either in foil or banana leaves over charcoal, and then with just scallions and roasted peanuts, and then you'd have the fish sauce, the seasoned fish sauce, and everyone would have rice paper wrappers and make their own, essentially spring rolls, but with this fish. And that's one of the things that I miss the most and think back upon really fondly. And growing up in the South and near water, that we always, I think it was one thing that we found very comforting was the presence of and the importance of seafood in Southern culture, and the access to it was familiar, very familiar.
Yeah, I mean, you go fishing and catch fresh fish and then eat it.
Totally, yeah. And then the crabs too, that I loved. And then more on the sort of Southern American side is we'd go to there are a bunch of different crab shacks and that we could go to and buy like 3 dozen and just sit at the table with newspaper.
Just cracking legs open.
Yeah, just cracking legs open. Old Bay, love Old Bay.
Yeah, that's a very DMV flavor. And I joke with people like the reference to DMV for a lot of folks who aren't from like Virginia or Maryland. They always give me a funny look. Like, what do you mean you rep the DMV? What does that mean? Like, you stand in line for hours? I don't know. Why would anyone rep the DMV?
Right.
Anyway, I wish we had more time that I could talk. I wanted to talk more about your music career and everything. Hopefully you can come back on the podcast in the future. But I want to thank you, Thao, for being a guest here on Southern Fried Asian.
Thank you so much for having me.
Where can people find you online, or if there's any tours? Is there a way that people can follow you and look up what you have coming for the masses?
Yeah, for the masses. For all of the masses. Well, the website is ThaoandTheGetDownStayDown.com, and then all the social media stuff is Thao Get Stay Down. And I do have a solo Midwestern tour coming up, and I'd imagine that there will be more events around this documentary. I hope to to be more involved in some Q&A stuff and help this film be more a part of the conversation around humanizing refugees in the present day.
We definitely need it in this climate we live in now. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
What to say, what to say, what to say.
Once again, I want to thank my guest this week, Thao Nguyen of Thao and the Get Down, Stay Down. Remember, the world premiere of her documentary, Nobody Dies, will premiere on September 7th at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco at 5:45 p.m. You can still get tickets at jccsf.org. The movie is funded by the Center for Asian American Media and will premiere on PBS this fall. And thank you once again for listening to Southern Fried Asian. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and Google Play, and follow us on Twitter at Southern Fried Asian. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried. Thanks, y'all.